Labour joining the party at 14. After Cambridge, with the West, the first local line there in this was brought back in 2001. Ministerial jobs under Blair and Brown followed, and politics was in tune with the times. Here, defending the use of PFI to rebuild hospitals.
Like the old-fashioned way of very, very long queue of frustrating waiting. PFI allows us to deliver hospitals in more towns and cities today.
He was number 2 at the Treasury, Health Secretary and Culture Secretary. And it was in that job he heard the anger of Liverpool fans in memorial service marking the 20th anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster.
They at least pledge that 96 fellow football supporters who died will never be forgotten. And that's at this time.
Spurred further on to put the issue of cabinet and campaign for a second inquiry into the disaster. In 2010, Burnham stood to be Labour leader for the first time. Again, 5 years later.
You're having another crack at leadership. Yeah, last time I want to do it again.
Well, not quite, as it turned out. But in 2015, Jeremy Corbyn transformed rivals that looked like Andy Burnham's prime ministerial ambitions had been thwarted for good. And as Labour moved left, Andy Burnham moved with it, serving Corbyn's shadow cabinet. But in 2017, he quit Westminster and was elected Greater Manchester Mayor, first of 3 government victories.
Strong point.
And then he put the area of bus services back under public control and presided over a city that was booming with the sun. How much credit can he claim for the area's economic growth? Jennifer Williams, the FT Northern England correspondent.
I think he's learned lessons on the ground, the way that Greater Manchester has carried things out and the way that Greater Manchester kind of worked across all sorts of different boundaries, public, private, political, to get to where it's got to now.
There was Andy Burnham's stand against regional lockdowns during COVID. We saw his profile soar, burnishing his image as a champion of the North, standing up for Westminster.
Greater Manchester, the Liverpool City region and Lancashire are being set up as the canaries in the coal mine for an experimental regional lockdown strategy. Greater Manchester will stand firm.
And by the time Labour found itself back in power, Burnham was buzzing around party conferences with the same question again and again.
Are you disloyal, Mr. Burnham?
There is a Westminster joke, far retired now, overtelling about the Blairites around organised walking into a pub. What have you had, Mr. Burnham? Asked the father. A critics say talking to the people and Elizabeth in a bomber jacket. Politics change with fashion. He insists that it's nonsense that the Burnham premiership is a new vision for the country, just a change of minds. contest, I'm concerned we run the risk of banks in the leadership contest at the time of achieving this situation. I'm also concerned that potential candidates must have the skill as to what their policy vision is insufficiently detailed. Aaron Moon, the MP of Cairngorm, Redmond, told us the idea that the 1% we should return inwards is frankly within what's fair. Ollie Billington is the Labour MP for East Greenwich and a Vice Chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Good afternoon. Ian says he has plans. He says one election 2 years ago they were best for the next one and by this regard.
Well, none of us hopes to be in this situation. Many of us, including myself, who are part of the committee, for all the internal and informal and more formal channels and backbenchers have been trying to make sure that this Labour government delivers on its promises and delivers on our values. We have really struggled over the last 2 years. We're telling the successes that we've had. We've made representations of how to tell us doing better. We've made representations on how to reform the state, mitigate them when they happen. And yet we're still at this situation where the public have told us pretty strongly that they want to see not just a change that we promised, but also something a bit more hopeful. People are in a situation where we all have to want to be turning against each other, and that's why I'm disappointed that the Prime Minister has been talking about fighting on. That's not the language that we need, and it's not the process that we need. We need something that's both dignified and then gives them an opportunity for legacy, and gives us the opportunity to serve the British people in the way that we promised the people years ago, but that we still are committed to do so. With ambition of working in the face of those very different.
You're talking about Prime Minister standing in that place.
What I think is I think that's what he deserves. I think it's not like he wasn't achieving things. This is a situation which is really difficult, and none of us would want to be in this situation, either for ourselves or for the country. And some of those people, external pressures, which will anyone who will in that job will have to manage, but there are also upward areas.
There are lots of concerns between very much these things just what there should be as the end should stand down and you and learn and those experiments. But the prime issue is the last thing the party needs because the contenders need to be yes, they need to be about anything else there and set out a scope.
I would also say that we're not entrepreneurs who do that. The Prime Minister has to take reflect himself in the situation we're in. Russian situation we're in with Rana. However, I think there will be one leadership action and I think that both of those are in position. And they are very rare ahead of time when people have time. And I think they've got numbers that turn on each other and something that my colleagues are concerned about. So we need to find a way to manage this shift, which enables us to be able to continue to serve the country.
Harriet Harman said on, just hang on 1 second, I've got just let me respond to Harriet Harman said on the debate this morning, if you blind tasted the policies of Wes Street and Andy Burnham and the Prime Minister, you wouldn't know the difference between them, you wouldn't be able to name whose policy was what. Is that part of this down to the Prime Minister's communications? Is that what Andy Burnham brings the Prime Minister back?
Well, I have a lot of respect for Harriet. I've been for a very long time. She's a very, very significant figure in our movement. I would politely disagree with her that in a blind test, blind tasting test, we'd be able to see the difference. I do think that the difference is of a strength. In order for us to be able to achieve the change that we have to do, so I think that's key. What happened in the conversation that was something I've not been allowed in particular is that the intent of the line, well, somebody very well, facts change and do change the line. So it's a very different situation now in terms of our public services to the ones that Andy was quoted a little bit earlier. We need to be able to approach things in order for us to be able to tackle the consequences of 14 years of neglect and the fact that our public very much have to reduce it. Our social public being very good and we're looking at long-term planning that growth by leaders and children and president and
given we'll have more of this story on PM 5 o'clock, but we'll be joined by the Environment Secretary and Gerald and Robert Change. Just in case anyone's in doubt about the constraints facing whoever ends up running the country in the next few months, and here's the Office of National Statistics publishing government borrowing figures for all their difference between terms and royalties and tax. They borrowed £23 billion in May, up almost a third on the same month last year, £5.5 billion, sending a credible billions of government debt. So that's about paying the interest up Ms. Curtis with Director of Fiscal Policy and Treasury, she's now Chief Executive of the Resolution Foundation.
Yeah, so as you say, definitely not good news this morning. When you look at April and May together, all that borrowing means that we're about 7.7 billion higher over those last 2 months than the Office of Budget Responsibility expected when they did their last forecast in March. As you said, a huge bulk of that is driven by higher debt interest spending, and in particular by a jump in inflation in March that we saw at the start of the war in Iran. Now, I think in terms of what this means going forward, it's early in the financial year. There are some elements of these figures that will tend to move up and down, particularly as we go from month to month. What will matter most when we get to forecast presumably in more in terms of the war in Iran and whether we see Strait of Hormuz reopening. What we do know is that we've already done some economic damage, and we're starting to see that in these figures today. I doubt we've seen all of the physical effects, even just from the war over the last few months. We know, for example, that the cost of government borrowing is still higher than it was before the war, and that will continue to drive these debt interest numbers up. And inflation is still expected to be higher this year than was anticipated, thanks to those higher energy costs that we've already had.
Presumably, if this trend continues, it eats away at the so-called headroom, the sort of the extra, the back pocket money that the Chancellor budgeted for, and that means any spending pledges become even more difficult.
Absolutely. So when we talk about headroom, we mean relative to these fiscal rules that the Chancellor has. Those target 3 years' time. And so what we have to think about are the sort of effects that might persist for 3 years. Some of the effects in day-to-day won't, but if the cost of government borrowing in the market continues to be high and expected to remain high, that will feed through to those numbers. And if growth is expected to be weaker than it otherwise would be. Absolutely, we see some of those effects, and I would expect them to still be, if we had to take a call today, a worse set of forecasting rules than we had in March. And there are other things going on too. Whoever is Prime Minister or Chancellor will have to decide what to do about defence spending. We have general paths for public spending that are much tighter at the end of the path than they were at the start. And of course, all of these costs and higher inflation are also falling on households. Governments may want to provide support to households through that period to lower that cost of living, and that matters too.
Ms. Judges from Resolution Foundation, thank you very much for taking this in. Well, it's likely for Burning to sand and sunburn this weekend, at least for those in the south of the UK, and then it gets hotter and hotter the next office. And on Monday and Tuesday, that means that general population comes as a consequence of the spot nudge 40 degrees centigrade. Ms. Bentley's Chief Executive of the Royal Meteorological Society influences in the studio. Hello. Is what we are getting now, these sort of quite frequently based by our own standards here in the south, is it a sign of what you think might come this summer? operate the June record here in the UK, they'll see that book certainly across Europe. Paris, for example, June record's 38, we'll mention it in the reporting next week. So they're becoming much more intensely record breaking, and we're only in June, so start of the summer. So yeah, likely to see people go through for the rest of the summer as well.
Extraordinary numbers. It's already very popular. It's only yeah, what again, they have or is this extended now throughout as you go on?
So we've got an area of high pressure which is sitting pretty much over the whole western Europe, and so it's Italy, Spain, France, Portugal, and we'll see that continuing over to the UK course as well. That high pressure will move around, so the heat itself will move. It's not going to sit there for the next 3 months over the summer. It may disappear completely for a while and then come back. So it's not wall-to-wall heat for the next 2 or 3 months. But we will expect to see heat waves coming back. And as I say, it's a donut and it's quite slow moving. So it's around for a while for those who probably can see it through the weekend into next week, or even on the Tuesday. But even as we go through the rest of next week, probably even to the end of June, we're going to see quite nice temperatures.
We have had talk of the changing summers that Europe will have, and the way that may impact the ability to go to traditional holiday hotspots and stuff. Spain recently, is that something you're looking at? The way that the summers are already?
So go on to Mediterranean to see the sunshine and the heat when it's too hot. Not only temperatures, but wildfires, because of last summer, wildfires prominent lines into the Mediterranean, and getting close where people live, so the hotels and resorts that were having to be evacuated because of wildfires. So it is a very real problem. We've not seen the frequent range yet across Europe, but that's likely to go. I would say sometime in the next few years, we will see a frequent somewhere across Europe.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Time for a couple of quick headlines, and Burnham-Stock supporters, it's time to lay out a key path following his resounding victory in the Labour by-election. And the Prime Minister has again insisted he will run if there's a challenge to his leadership and called on Labour to pull together to avoid punching hunting into chaos. The end is at 5. This is John Garner. That's the world.
Now, on Radio 4 is Alex Forsyth with 10 years after Brexit.
It is 10 years since the Brexit referendum. I'm Alex Forsyth, a BBC correspondent who's covered Brexit for both Brussels and Westminster. A decade after the decision to leave the EU, what impact has it had on various aspects of public and political life? This isn't an exhaustive examination, but it is an attempt to understand some of the consequences of Brexit 10 years on.
The British people have voted to leave the European Union. Let June the 23rd go down in our history as our Independence Day!
UK resolve has been deeply disappointed and profoundly concerned.
We can get Brexit done!
I'm sorry. We will miss you.
There is no doubting just how divisive Brexit was. Whatever side of the debate you sat on, the threat would be it split rupture of political parties and targeted finances. In the years after the referendum, the country watched while Westminster was dominated by intense family, but right bandwidth was focused on Brexit. New political identities emerged, leavers and remainers, and in 2019, an entire general election was dominated by Brexit. So has it had a lasting impact on Labour, feel and vote now? I spoke to Paul Savage, Professor of Political Sociology at the University of Bristol, and Rob Moore, Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester, who started by describing how he thinks Brexit has shaped our politics.
We saw the Brexit line up along this new divided lines that are quite distinctive rather than that are separated from Labour and Tory, but were already becoming evident in the way that we were thinking in terms of the minor parties that were growing before Brexit. People forget that the strongest supporters were our party what's important to me, really, what's important to you. So I think we're starting to come into the Brexit catalyzed that for the strongest connected to Brexit class income. They were education, age, social values, and then those became linked to we didn't have any presidents negotiations to decide what that meant for both sides, whether we could restrain it and why the party system is again without me knowing at all. But I think it probably have a bigger impact long run on the league side. Leaguers are already more prone to trust politics and trust intelligence that they're really somehow frustrated or watered down. So when they start seeing evidence of that might be happening, they got quite worried about it quite quickly. So in some respects, it may well have laid the groundwork for this reappearance of Farage even stronger because these voters have not forgotten that their rules
still broadly define themselves as either leave or remain?
I don't think they're as strong as I noticed they were leading up to that. They gave people labels for whole package of things that were described there. I think one of the key things that Brexit did in that sense was to give this slightly disparate bunch of attitude, values and views a label that they could kind of unite behind. But that happened at the same time that the old divides were still there, which is to some extent why we start to see much more significant fragmentation. Because if new divides come along, the old divides are still there to some extent. So you do still see some people on the left of the old divide supporting Leave, and people on the right of the old divide supporting UK. And that's feeding into the fragmentation that we're seeing there.
Well, at the 2019 general election, Boris Johnson campaigned on the slogan, "Get Brexit Done." And we saw areas at that election that had traditionally been Labour turn Conservative. So how instrumental do you think that Brexit was in breaking those old political alliances?
Well, it was important, but I think that importance does need to be set in a bit of context because there were a number of moving parts there. If you take these red wall seats we've discussed for so long ever since, Labour's vote was actually declining in a lot of those places for a long time. Indeed, if you go all the way back to 2001, you'll see really big slumps in turnout in those places. In the new Labour election, 20 years before Boris Johnson made large partisan attachments to Labour were fake for a long time in those places. But what there still was relatively red campaign to turn point by Conservatives from James Black's story to describe places where demographically and good enough bolsters not to win. That was the paradox. And what the Johnson effect was to break down that last barrier. So it was a breakthrough. It was a breakthrough that the walls had been weakening for a long time before they came down.
Well, once the walls did finally come down, for all the reasons that Rob has expressed there, do you think that is what has led in part to where we are now with this increasingly fragmented politics, where people perhaps are able to look to other parties that they might not have considered before?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to add to what Rob was saying there. We actually saw quite a lot of weakening in those red wall seats, increases in the Conservative vote and the Labour vote in the 2017 election. So a lot of credit is given to Boris Johnson to get Brexit done in 2019, but many of those trends really started in 2017 as well. But this weakening of identity is what allows people to move around, is what contributes to the kind of volatility that we see. Big shifts in vote shares between elections.
swayed voters rather than bank on their support. At the same time, distrust in politicians has grown. Both Labour's and Remainers have reason to believe Brexit will deliver what they wanted. In recent years, the UK's relationship with the EU has slowed down on the agenda. With the individual being reset and the table, we are so far in a less fractious fashion. This is how choices politicians make now will be crucial to their own fate, as well as the government's. Changing attitudes to Ireland after Brexit vote. 10 years after Brexit, Ireland on the border patrol is Monday. Very shortly, with number year 3, Mark Forrest will be introducing the former Liverpool Philharmonic. His orchestra opens this week in a recent concert performance of the Symphony Fantastique from Hector Berlioz. It's a semi-autobiographical story of a young lovesick musician who despair attempts to put himself into a series of unconventional sessions. Times treasured and sentiment from the 19th century.
Weekend debate was a baseline also recognised because Johnson predicted he would be referred back to number 10, but hers was moved. If Sir Keir Starmer's position has not changed by Monday, then I think things could get quite messy quite fast for the Prime Minister.
Conservative leader Kevin Baden offers travel to the north east of Scotland to celebrate the party's by-election victory in Aberdeen South. The Tory candidate, Douglas Lumsden, gave the seat to the Scottish National Party. He said he would hold the seat for the Green Party. Escalation that undermines efforts to establish peace in the region. Even the talks between the US and Iran, which were due to start in Switzerland, have been postponed by the determination. It's hopeful that they're going to face more problems.
We investigate stuff just what we do in our Harmony podcast talk about. I'm BBC correspondent Marianne Spring.
And I'm investigative reporter Matt Shea.
Every week we look at the stories spilling out from our screens and into real life.
To work out what's actually real
And what's not. Top comment.
listen on BBC Sites.
The case has been reopened and police are sifting through CCTV. Whether it's seriously real techniques. We've all heard of hardware and software, but what about wet but now happening after 2005 hackers. First time, we're all advanced cases having a lesson from an expert web maker. Just Yeah. Hold on. Look. Here. There's a bird.
Oh, where is it?
I think it's rats. It's like rabbits that's it's from practically upstairs. This can't work out what they do.
We'll be back to catch him and it's
Oh no. Lovely on the other of the bird. That's what covered when I was dealing with the street budget and
no, don't worry, I'll do it.
Just by yourself. Oh, well done, you two. It's hard to reach it so fast. Thank you. I'll tell the others. I get the group has changed from such a commitment. Maybe you say that to something. There is about hospitals, schools, shelters.
I feel like I'm coming into some street so fast. Carry on, go Nicholas.
I don't need courage or simplicity.
Susan, very upset last night. Caution.
Martin has been part of reading the most messages this week. David Sub. Thankfully, it's no longer blamed Tappy's death on a mission to system. Well, obviously, I blame them. The folks up to me. The lack of ban and general public possibly found and their lifestyle
I mean, access to the countryside, simply we don't want to move them all irresponsible.
Last, do you think these walkers care about the countryside? It's legal technical mission federate, empty beer cans just to the creator.
I am opposed to them. Anyway, what I'm talking to is the just to show it
I'm seeing adverts everywhere. first thing I had to
I have to admit, there's something beautiful about a soul.
turn the lid, it's way off. On my way.
No, you're right. Yeah, it's just rubbish.
So it does. So, you don't even know what
I'm still going to think about hay.
Anything nice, man? What's the I'm on the back come up there, well, we do I'm not having the office. The farm is just security. She seems to be talking to her. That's it. To me, when she was playing again, you're going to be a person. Isn't people pursuing around the road and he's going to get the money? No, I'm going to break with your words and there's no You think what I call magic? I often tell this would make take the red rabbits and chops that just clean who's next? I guess so. Magic. In what world will guess sitting on the top? In what world is the body hanging out? Anyway.